Howard Mosher is here as our guest today. Howard, the world-renowned Vermont writer who has rendered 10 novels, I think. Is it 10?
10.
10. Wow. And I've done 5 movies, if you count the one where I was screwing around with those high school kids.
That's good.
5 feature films and some documentaries and a TV show. And you and I are about to work, we've worked together on 4 stories so far. High Water, Where the Rivers Flow North, A Stranger in the Kingdom, and Disappearances. And we're about to do our 5th, Northern Borders, with Marlboro College.
Which is the one that I've been looking forward to doing the most, because that's of all my books, my favorite.
Uh-huh. Now why is that?
I think it's because although I didn't really base the boy in the book on myself, he feels the same way about his grandparents that I felt about my rather eccentric grandparents. He loves them. Mm-hmm. And although it could be argued that they might on some level love each other, the grandparents certainly don't like each other, but they like young Austin. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that affection that makes them my favorite, makes that my favorite book.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a wonderful book, and I've been working on the screenplay. I've built it out to about 200 pages so far, and of course I have to then shrink it down to about 110 probably. But it's very rich, and presents the usual Mosher challenges, whether it's having to blow away a 1927 dam, or even a driving dam, or in the case of Disappearances, the boats, the trains, the guns, everything else that went along that. But here we have an elephant, among other things, a carny at the county fair whose whole arm is practically believable as a reptile, as a snake.
Maybe it is.
Maybe it is. Anyway, I'm recruiting students who are good with drawing and painting and construction and sculpture, and the art department in this film is going to have a great time. Wow. And a room called Egypt, which creates, again, your work is so rooted in Vermont, but also what I call the historical imagination of Vermont. It's not something you would find at the Historical Society. It's something that you connect to these different periods of time and place, but then just, it both has this sort of verisimilitude and also wonderful imagination of magic and enchantment, and at the same time, the overwhelming power of the natural world, and of course these relationships of family, quirky and odd that they are.
Yes, I'm a born liar.
Yeah, right.
And it happens since the day I first picked up my pen. But you mentioned cutting the screenplay down from 200 pages to something closer to, 90, 100 pages? That's the method I use, too.
So you build it out, you write it long, and then you...
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think Northern Borders was over 1,000 pages long in its early incarnations. And then by degrees, I cut it down and cut it down. But even at that, I have more room in a 400-page book than you do in a 90-minute movie. And I remember when you made A Stranger in the Kingdom, you wanted to film the baseball conversation on top of the mountain between the editor and his 2 sons, and I think you did write that
we did scene, initially, yes.
And I don't know if you filmed it or not, but it just didn't move the movie ahead. And that's when you explained to me that I had a lot of elbow room in my books that you don't really have in a very tight movie. In some ways, it's a tighter art form. And after you explained that to me, never once in any of your movies did I think, why didn't he use my favorite scene from that book? For one thing, usually you did. But I think that the novel is one thing, the movie is something quite
It has to take on a life of its own and has its own logic, its own momentum, its own tone. I mean, there's so much in your books that make up the whole universe that would be great to capture, and you could if you did them as a miniseries, I think. Although I look at Empire Falls. Have you seen the Empire Falls series?
I have, yes, and it's one of my favorite novels, too. And I love the movie with Paul Newman.
And of course they built that into a miniseries, and that was the only way to handle it. It lacks, in some cases, the dramatic drive of a feature film, where you have to be compact and where you have to get it going and keep it on track and make the relationships spark and sizzle and do all the rest. But that's the other comment you made toward me at one point, saying that, you know, I make your characters sometimes deal with each other more than you might even like them to, but, you know, I start having to find ways to sort of push them into closer proximity. Of course, Northern Borders has a lot of that spark and a lot of that conflict right off the bat, so that's not really an issue there.
That's going to be fun to do with Northern Borders, because to go back to what I said about the grandparents not liking each other, they haven't really spoken a word directly to one another in several decades, and their family refers to their relationship as the 40 Years' War. So that's going to be a fun movie to cast, Jay.
Yeah. Of course, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward were at one point lined up to play those parts, and they would have been great.
They were.
I mean, he was that sort of charming rascal and could be completely a misanthrope if that's what he chose to be, but still the humanity and, you know, the underlying lightness, you know, could always come through with him. He never took anything too seriously.
That fell through at the 11th hour, but, you know, sitting here and thinking about what you're going to do with Northern Borders, I'm kind of glad the Newman Project did fall through, because, as you know, I love each and every one of your movies. I think that you have a genius for writing them and casting them.
We've had some fun actors to work with.
We've had some very interesting actors to work with. One thinks of Rip Torn,
right,
going into his trailer and refusing to come out for a few days.
Until we called you and brought you down to sort of talk him out with the promise of a fly fishing expedition.
Yes,
we were. You know, a couple of rounds of scotch. I can't remember what it was.
I told him I would take him to my second best trout pool in the Northeast Kingdom. But he was a perfect Noel Lord, wasn't he?
And when we sent him actually to help open the film in Denver, I got a call. I don't know whether I ever told you this story. You know, Howard promised to take me trout fishing, and, you know, you owe me one. So I had to actually outfit him with a trout fishing guide in Colorado in order to get him to show up at the screening there.
The perils of movie making, I can believe it.
Yeah. I actually was raised by my grandparents. I don't know whether you knew that, but I was, at the age of 6 years old, put on a train from Philadelphia to Providence, Rhode Island after the breakup of my parents, and went to a summer camp there, but then landed via a tour bus back at my grandparents' place in Pennsylvania, where I spent the next 5 years.
And your grandmother, when you were young, took you to see movies and good
right.
movies, and that's where you developed your love of movies.
Yeah, it really was. So, I mean, I'm wondering, you know, we're going to do this as a project with Marlboro College. You very graciously and kindly, the Paul Newman Project may have been your less favored scenario, but you would have made a lot more money on that scenario. But you've been totally in the spirit of this project and making the story available at a cost that we can work into a low-budget, student-driven project where we have 10 professionals, 25 college students, going for broke next spring to make this film. What do you have to say to students, to college students, as you encounter them? You've traveled a lot across the country with your books, aspiring writers, people that really want to find their voice. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've had a long and checkered background with the academic world, and my last foray into the academic world, as you know, was going out to the MFA program at the University of California at Irvine some 40 years ago now, and staying 3 days. I felt entirely cut off from my material back here in Vermont, and Phyllis, my wife, and I went for a quick ride and wound up at the intersection of Hollywood and Vine in downtown Hollywood and downtown Los Angeles, and a telephone truck pulled up beside us, and I think the truck driver must have seen our green Vermont license plates, because he called out the window, "I'm from Vermont too, go back while you still can." So I did, and you know what happened after that. I became better acquainted with the Northeast Kingdom and the real world, as we might say, and wrote my books. I think the great thing about Marlboro is that it's constantly interfacing with the real world. You know, bringing Jay Craven in to serve on the staff and talk about movies and then make a movie is that kind of thing is unheard of in the academic world today. So the Marlboro students are lucky because they're constantly exposed to the kinds of experiences they're going to have after Marlboro. And what an opportunity this is for me, but I think also for the students who are going to be involved in it. As you were saying on the way down, you know, a student can take a resume to a studio in Hollywood with all A's, but if a student can say, I was in a movie, I worked on a movie, I had experience with a movie, that's foot in the door. That's the real world.
Plus, they meet people that can help to lead them to their next
Absolutely.
stage. I mean, I think that really is a lot of what it's about.
Mentors.
And we've seen that happen. And we actually had 10 Marlboro students and 7 alumni that worked on Disappearances. And for the Windy Acres television series that we did, the whole crew was Marlboro students, basically, except for 2, the production designer and the cinematographer, but the camera operators were Marlboro students, the grips, the gaffers, the script supervisor. And I think, you know, you look at how many film schools there are across the country, and there are plenty of them, and they produce more students than can possibly work in the film industry. And then the question of the film industry versus independent filmmaking, and of course that's what our commitment is to really finding a regional voice, finding an independent voice, being able to develop sustainable filmmaking production and not to have to simply depend on the industry. But I think that these students get plenty of training, plenty of background. In some ways, they're overtrained and underexperienced. I mean, that's part of my thinking on this project, is that you bring these kids in here, they have enough exposure, enough experience to fully serve in responsible senior positions. A number of them will have the ability and the opportunity to take leadership on a production. They'll experience the culture of the production, which is part of what so many of these kids don't get, and frankly, some of them will decide they never want to do it again. But others will actually realize, this is for me. And I think that's what's exciting to bring students together in this situation, is to see that dynamic. Because it's a charged experience for all of them, whether it's at 3 o'clock in the morning when they're hungry and it's raining outside and they're trying to get the last 2 shots before they collapse.
Or snowing.
Or snowing, or as in Crawford Notch, 5-degree temperatures with 35-mile-an-hour winds, where the crew did revolt, in fact, and had to move them from this, you know, Fleabag hotel into a place with a sauna and a hot tub. That was the last 3 days of production. But I think that, you know, this applied experience, especially when committed to a story that has resonance, that has meaning, that is a real story that is intended for a large audience and an appreciative audience. I mean, particularly here in New England. I mean, we've taken these films to 100 towns in Vermont, 60 more towns in Maine and New Hampshire, another 25, 30 towns in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut. I mean, we really believe in the importance of this to New England as a whole, and the idea that Hollywood does not have a monopoly on the stories that get told, and there are good stories right here. And this is a big story. I mean, it's a rich story. It's got loads of characters. It's got wonderful period detail. It's got wonderful art direction that's possible. These students will be challenged to the hilt. This is not 2 people in an apartment, you know, talking over coffee. This is, you know, as usual with the Mosher pictures. I mean, it's a Vermont Western, which has also been part of what has made, you know, this whole experience great. I mean, Walt Andrews in Stranger in the Kingdom, to me, is Shane, you know, and, you know, Noel Lord encountering the sort of end of a way of life, the extinction of his way of life, is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. You know, I mean, there are these great themes really rooted deeply in America, in American culture, but specifically in New England culture. Wow, you know, an unconventional Western with a sphinx and an elephant in the middle of Marlboro, Vermont.
There isn't any real over-the-top villain, though, in Northern Borders, as there is in Disappearances and my most recent book, Walking to Gatlinburg. And in both cases, in Disappearances with the villain Carcajou,
right,
the Wolverine, who is frightening to this day for me to see on the screen. He's, I'm sorry to say, based rather closely on my great-great-grandfather, who when he was just about the age I am now, and I'm 69, went right off the deep end and decided to murder his entire family by building an explosive device and planting it in the cellar. And my great-great-grandpa went around the neighborhood the night he made this device and showed it to his neighbors. He had gift wrapped it. That's diabolical. And they said, Levi, what's in that package? And he said, a present for my wonderful little grandson, who would have been my grandfather. So in some instances, I've transplanted family history from where I grew up in upstate New York over to the Vermont setting of the stories. But there isn't really any villain of those proportions in Northern Borders. And in some ways, I think Northern Borders is the most character-driven of the stories that you've undertaken to film so far. I think it will be the most challenging, and I also think it will be the best.
Well, we have our favorites, and they're like our kids. I'm sure that you feel the same way with your books. You know, you love them all. For me, I know which one is the orphan. I knew which one, was able to be the big man on campus and didn't need anybody to introduce it or make excuses for it. Disappearances has tended to be, as I mentioned to you before, the one that has spoken to me in the largest number of ways and for the longest period of time. It just kept percolating and percolating. After it was finished, I just started to just get more out of it all the time, and that was really, for me, wonderfully exciting. I would go back and somebody in an audience would say something about the film that I hadn't thought about before. They'd respond to the magical realism or to the characters. And that would open up a whole other way of sort of thinking about the film and seeing it. And, for me, just as an act of imagination and something that continued to stimulate, my imagination. And I see that in this picture, too. The relationship between the grandparents in particular and the kid. So much remains to be discovered in this. I mean, the book leads to the screenplay, which by necessity thins it out, that will include 25%, 20% of the number of words that the book has. So you're sketching all the time, and then you're creating space also for the actors to come and breathe some different kind of life into it. And that's, this is a story that does that. If you look at TV movies frequently, what's there is there. There's not much left to the imagination. What I love about these stories is that they're just ripe in every moment for further discovery, further shaping, and that it percolates and continues to resonate even when the film is done in ways that are unexpected. They take on a life of their own, and I think that's a lot of what I want these students to experience, is that creative process, is the idea that nothing is fixed. It remains fluid, it remains open-ended, it remains subject to their own interpretation, it remains available for them to discover, and I think that your writing provides that space.
Well, thank you. Now, the New York Times book reviewer didn't agree with your assessment of disappearances. I think that review was headlined, "Vermont Writer Should Disappear." And that wasn't a bad thing to happen to me at a young age, because I made up my mind I wasn't going to. But you mentioned the elephant and the snake man, and there's some other scenes. The grandmother's room that she calls Egypt, where she has the Egyptian artifacts. All those scenes could be seen as over the top, but I was thinking of what I might leave Marlboro students who are interested in writing with. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever heard a writer give was in a bar in Nashville. My wife and I had gone to hear a young singer, who debut her career in this horrible back street bar. And sitting in the back of the room was an old-timer. He had long iron gray hair that hung way down his back, and he was just pounding down Boilermakers, one right after another, a double shot in one hand and a draft beer in the other, just as hard as he could go. And the people we went to the debut with pointed him out to me, and you said, you know, that guy was at one time the best writer of authentic country music and Americana music in Nashville. So if Johnny Cash scribbled 2 lines on the back of an envelope, this songwriter was the guy Johnny would take the lines to make it into a real song. Well, he drank up everything he'd earned and fell off the wagon and got back on and wrote some more good songs. Your friend Chris Christopherson would have known him. And then he fell off the wagon again. And here he was, it was sad, drinking himself to death right there in front of us in this bar. But when the young woman finished her set of songs, he beckoned her back with a big drunken gesture and said, "Girlie, come on back here. I want to give you a piece of advice." So she quite timorously approached his table where he was continuing to drink, and he looked at her and he said, "When you're home alone at midnight writing them songs, and then when you get up to sing them, don't never hold nothing back." And with that, his eyes glazed over again, and he went back to his booze. And a year later, I heard, sadly, he had drunk himself to death. But I've thought many times that that was an inspired piece of information for an older writer or an older artist of any kind to give a younger artist. You know, if it doesn't work, some of those 200 pages that you wrote may not work. You can always take them out. But if you don't write it from in here to start out with, you don't have nothing.
Yeah, right.
Don't never hold nothing back. I think that's what I would tell the Marlboro students who are interested in any artistic enterprise or any dream, for that matter, following any dream.
And through your practice, if you do that, you develop instincts. And then you trust your instincts, and then they're available to you in the moment that you create. You know, and you may still reshape it or get rid of it later, but you start to charge on all cylinders, and then, you know.
Or wish you had gotten rid of it when you read the New York Times, or maybe not. Maybe not.
Well, critics are a vanishing breed, and they keep us honest at some level, or we can, I think increasingly, the longer you work, you can sort of tell when they strike a chord and when they just don't get it, you know. Now we should before we depart, talk about what you do with your reviews that you don't like. You have a special place for them.
Yes, I do. And for years, starting with that unamiable review of Disappearances, I have taken that kind of unfriendly correspondence out and nailed it up to the side of my garage, and I gave up hunting 40 years ago, but I blast the smithereens out of those with my 16-gauge shotgun, and it is very, very satisfying.
Yeah.
First time I did that, I think my wife was concerned. You know, she didn't know what I was doing out in the yard, but she knew about the bad review I'd gotten. So I took the review up, and she was standing on the porch, and I showed it to her, and the birdshot had gone through the body of the review, and she looked at it and said, "Next time, get the reviewer's name." That's the Northeast Kingdom method of dealing with, with the review.
That's why we're the least populated part of the state.
You better believe it. Yeah.
Howard, thank you for coming to Marlboro. It's a great honor for this college. As you know, the campus read Stranger in the Kingdom over the summer, and I was here on Sunday, and they were percolating about it then, and I think that it was a revelation to many of them, and also, in some cases, their first connection to Vermont. And I think that your presence here really means a lot to everybody.
I'm surprised they still came after reading Stranger in the Kingdom. Thank you, Jay.
Good. Thank you.